What's happening, folks? Arush here, and today we're talking about photosynthesis, and we're going to take a closer look of actually what's going on inside of the chloroplast. The last time we spoke, the big idea was the equation, which was we start off with 6 molecules of CO2. The plant's going to take in 6 molecules of water, H2O, and in the presence of sunlight, that's going to give us C6, H12O6, which is glucose, and it's also going to give us 6 oxygen, 6O2. Today what we're going to do is we're going to look at inside of the chloroplast and how is the plant working to make this glucose and this oxygen. Okay, so we're going to find out where this comes from and how the plant gets the energy to make those things. So before we get into this, we got to know the parts of the chloroplast. If you look at these plant cells right here, okay, all these various plant cells, inside of them, all these green discs, these would be the different chloroplasts. And this is where photosynthesis is going to take place. So this is going to be the main focus of today's lecture. Now, when you look inside of the chloroplast, you see these discs, okay? Each of these single discs is called a thylakoid, okay? And this is where photosynthesis, the first part of it, is going to take place. Inside of that thylakoid is a green pigment known as chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is what's absorbing that sunlight. Okay. If we look at a whole stack of thylakoids, okay, like a stack of chips, that's called a granum. Okay, so a stack of granum is a stack of thylakoids, and what's going on in the thylakoid? That's the first part of photosynthesis. Okay. Now this fluid. There's a clear fluid around all the granum, and that's called the stroma. The stroma is the fluid around, and this is where the second part of photosynthesis is going to take place, inside of the stroma. Okay? And please make sure you get this, give a quick sketch in your notes. Okay? You don't need to worry about this page, but just make sure you sketch the chloroplast and label it. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of what's going on inside the chloroplast. I'm going to tell you what's going on, and then I'm going to go ahead and show you. Okay, so photosynthesis is broken up into 2 parts. We have the first one, which is the light reaction, and the second one is called the Calvin cycle. Now, what occurs in each cycle fits the name photosynthesis perfectly, and I'll show you why. If you break photosynthesis down, you have photo, which is light, and you have synthesis. And synthesis means to make. Okay? So if we were to look at a big picture, in the first reaction, the light reaction, we're going to use sunlight. We're going to use sunlight and convert solar energy or light energy. Go ahead and write that. Light energy, and we're going to convert that into chemical energy. Okay? And you guys will see what this looks like in a moment. In the second part, in the Calvin cycle, we're going to take that chemical energy and we're going to use that chemical energy to make glucose. Okay? So here's what this looks like. These are the 3 parts, 3 things for each reaction that I want you to know. Where it occurs, what goes in, and what comes out. So the first one, the light reaction, where does that occur? Well, that's going to take place in the thylakoid membranes, okay? Those little discs, all of those discs that we talked about, okay? Each individual disc is going to have the light reaction going on. What's going into the light reaction, what the light reaction uses, is first, it's going to be sunlight. Okay. Next, we're going to have water. So sunlight is going to strike the plant, and the water is going to travel up the plant's roots. Okay. What comes out, what the light reaction is going to make, is going to be oxygen. So this is where we get all the oxygen that we breathe. That's actually, that oxygen is actually coming from water, because water is H2O. So where does the oxygen come from that we breathe? Well, during the light reaction, those hydrogens actually pop off. They break apart, and we're actually breathing the oxygen that was once from water. And the other thing that's made in the light reaction is ATP, which we know is the energy currency. This is the main energy of a cell. And there's also another molecule of energy. It's called NADPH. Now, what's the difference between the two, ATP and NADPH? If you remember, I compared ATP to quarters at an arcade. Quarters are awesome. You can use them at any arcade, right? NADPH would be like a token. It carries energy, but it's not as valuable as ATP, okay? So just know that NADPH carries energy, but it's just not as valuable as ATP. Now, what's going to happen? That oxygen leaves the plant. That oxygen is released. We breathe that in. The ATP and NADPH, those two energy molecules, are going to go to the Calvin cycle, okay? So basically, the light energy is stored in these two molecules. And now this is called chemical energy. That's going to go to the Calvin cycle. Where does the Calvin cycle occur? That's in the stroma. Okay, so remember we said we have the thylakoid and the grana? Well, the stroma is the liquid around it, okay? That's where the Calvin cycle takes place. What goes in? We're going to use ATP and NADPH with carbon dioxide. Literally, plants are taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they're taking CO2 from the air, and they're making sugar out of it. Okay, so they're almost making sugar out of thin air, and then we're going to make glucose. Okay, so let's see what this looks like inside of the plant cell. And also, please sketch this whole thing down. You don't need to have all the chicken scratch. Okay, but please make sure this gets into your notes. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Here's our chloroplast. We have our granum and our thylakoids. And this is where the light reaction takes place. It's going to take place in the thylakoid membranes. Okay? So we're going to take in sunlight and water. Those go into the thylakoids, sunlight and water. And then we're going to get ATP and NADPH. That oxygen's going to leave. We breathe in that oxygen. Okay? And now we've captured that sunlight, the energy from the sunlight, into these two molecules, ATP and NADPH. Those energy molecules are going to leave and go to the stroma. And now we start part 2, the Calvin cycle. Okay? So part 1 takes place in the thylakoid, part 2 takes place in the stroma. Now, this energy, ATP and NADPH, is going to drive the Calvin cycle to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it's going to fix that carbon into delicious glucose. Okay? So I may ask you on a test, what is produced in the light reactions? What was made in the light reaction? Your answer should be oxygen and ATP and NADPH. I may ask you, what is made in the Calvin cycle? And your response would be glucose. Okay? Or I may ask you, where does the light reaction take place? And that would be the thylakoids. Where does the Calvin cycle take place? The stroma, which is the fluid around the thylakoids. Okay? Okay, so a quick recap. We discussed the parts of the chloroplast. We have these discs that are thylakoids. We have a stack of discs that is a granum. And we have this liquid, which is the stroma. Then we went into the light reaction. The light reaction uses water, H2O, and sunlight. And it makes oxygen, O2, and it makes ATP and NADPH. Remember, NADPH is another energy molecule, but it's just not as valuable as ATP. Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma. It's going to use ATP and NADPH from the light reaction, and it's going to use carbon dioxide, and it's going to make glucose. Okay? And that is it for today, and I hope that was helpful. See you guys next time.